1.
We'll hear a man called Tim and a woman called Laura discussing preparations for their holiday. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
Our plane tickets arrived this morning. It reminded me how much there is to do before we go.
Let's write everything down, shall we, so we don't forget anything?
Yes. And last time we went away, we almost forgot to collect our currency from the bank. So let's start with that.
Good thinking. And wasn't there an appointment you said you'd got to cancel?
Yes, the hairdresser. Thanks for reminding me. Can you write that down too? The shop will be closed now, but I'll do it first thing on Monday.
OK. Then starting on Tuesday, we've got to take the tablets we got from the pharmacy. We really mustn't forget to do that. We're not protected against malaria till we've been taking them for at least 7 days.
No, so that's really important.
And what about shopping? There's still a few things we've got to buy the next time we're in town. We need some more sunblock, don't we? We've only got that factor 10 stuff. It won't be strong enough.
I've already bought that. But what we do still need to get is sunglasses. The ones I've got aren't good enough, and I don't think yours are either.
OK, I've noted that down. And I think I'm going to get another bag too, just a small one. We always seem to come back with more things than we take.
Should we get an extra lock for our suitcase as well, just in case the one we've got breaks? They don't seem to last long.
Yes, they are a bit flimsy. OK, right. Oh yes, and we need an adapter for our electrical things, your hairdryer and my shaver. The plugs on them are bound to be the wrong type.
We could get one at the airport. They always have them there.
Well, I'd rather get it beforehand, so I'm writing it down. And then I think that's it, isn't it?
I think so, as far as shopping's concerned. But we also need to order a taxi to take us to the airport. We should do that well in advance. My sister left it too late and she had to take the train with that huge suitcase of hers.
I know. She really struggled with it.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 7 to 10.
Now, let's see. Your mother said she'd come in regularly while we're away, so what do we want her to do? I'll write some instructions and we can give them to her tomorrow.
Good idea. Well, the cat's the main thing.
OK. Feed the cat.
We ought to leave her the vet's details as well, just in case there's a problem.
Yes. Have you got them handy?
Hang on, I'm just looking. Yes, his name's Colin Jeffrey.
Is that spelt with a G?
Actually, it's Jeffrey. Quite an unusual spelling, isn't it?
And his number?
077 594 128. It's a mobile.
OK.
And you should write down where it is. It's 4 Street, not sure what number, but it's next to the bus stop, isn't it?
That's not a very good landmark, but it's on the other side of the road to the church, so I'll tell her that. Let's hope she won't need a vet anyway.
Yes. Right, apart from that, there are the plants to water. Ask her to make sure they don't dry out.
Oh, yes, and I've already mentioned the problem with the boiler, and your mum said she'd come round to meet the heating engineer and let him in.
Yes, it's a lot for her to do, but we really need to get the problem sorted out. And the earliest date I could get an appointment was April the 30th.
Isn't it the day after we go?
Yes, we leave on the 29th, and she'll have to hang around till the job's finished.
Oh, well, she won't mind, I'm sure. She likes helping people out.
Yes, she does.
OK. That's it then, I think. Unless you can think of anything else.
Not at the moment. Leave the list there and I'll add to it.
That is the end of part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 2.
Part 2. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 15. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 15.
So, Enrique, have you started your research project on cities yet?
I've done a bit of reading around the topic and made a few notes. But, if I'm honest about it, I really haven't done as much as I'd have liked to because I'm finding it a bit difficult.
You don't know how relieved I am to hear you say that. I feel the same way. I think the key is to be able to make valid research questions.
You're probably right about that. Didn't we have some lectures on how to write research questions? I think it was towards the beginning of the term.
Yes, we did. I've got my notes somewhere in this file. I tell you what, why don't we look at the notes together and then try and come up with some research questions? At least that would be a good starting point. Give us some sense of where we're going with this.
Brilliant idea. Let's get started. Okay. From what I remember, a good research question is all about knowing from the outset what it is you're trying to find out.
Yes. And now that I'm looking at my notes again, I see I've written here that it's to do with understanding and evaluation. So, understanding a particular issue and evaluating any problems around it. And of course, a very important part is not overlooking any research that has already been done. Past research is just as important as what is being done now.
It's a bit, I suppose, like looking at the research that's already been done and seeing if it agrees or disagrees with your own ideas.
Sure, I hear what you're saying. But to do that properly, you have to have a clear idea in your head what your own research question is. And by that, I mean specific areas you want to focus on. Let's face it, there's so much information out there, and we can't possibly include it all in 2,000 words.
Don't remind me. The thought of writing 2,000 words at the moment seems like a huge mountain to climb.
I know, but let's try to make a start. I think we're meant to be identifying what makes a successful city, and also try to explain why there has been such a steady population movement of people from rural to urban areas. But I'm a bit confused because I don't think this is meant to be the main focus of our research.
Perhaps that's why the lecturer said we need to write questions, and that must be our starting point.
Okay, well, what we're investigating is more than simply what elements make a city successful, but we're also trying to offer possible explanations. So, we have 2 questions. Why do people want to move to cities? And why do people choose to live in them?
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 16 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 16 to 20.
Okay then. I think the first issue concerning successful cities must be the economy. People move to cities for better job prospects, and successful cities are cities that have thriving economies.
That's true enough. It does mean that cities can offer good job opportunities, which seems to me to suggest that a city will only be successful if it attracts the right kind of people to work there.
What kind of person are you talking about?
Well, I suppose I'm referring to the skilled labor force. You know, the idea that up-and-coming young people will move to cities, settle there, maybe buy property, and so that city will get the most talented creative minds. But if a city doesn't offer this, then obviously it will lose out, as university leavers will choose elsewhere.
You could be right there. But I also think that when cities encourage businesses to develop, then you obviously have money pouring into the city, which can raise the general standard of living.
So we've definitely got a question worth investigating. But apart from the economic factor, I think another point worth mentioning is the environment.
Sure, we can research areas like the quality of the air, how clean it is, and then there's traffic. Is there too much traffic? How is it controlled? And also the issues of noise pollution and how the city manages its waste. Oh, and I nearly forgot. The environment includes green spaces like parks.
Those are all valid points, but I think you've overlooked the whole issue of beauty.
Beauty? Are you sure? What's beauty got to do with the environment?
Well, don't you think if you were deciding whether or not you would live in a city, your first impressions would be made with your eyes? So, the buildings in a city are really important. If the entire city looks like a concrete jungle, then it's unlikely to make people want to live there, is it? I think successful cities are those which have managed to strike a balance between old buildings and new ones. So, of course, you'd have some buildings reflecting more modern architecture, but others that haven't lost their character and still represent the past.
You're right, actually. I've often thought that buildings tell a story. I mean, you can tell the history of a place by looking at the buildings.
I know exactly what you mean. And let's not forget that the environment includes cultural aspects. So, for example, what's the cultural life like? For me, a successful city will be attractive because it will have lots to offer, like a good nightlife and a wide variety of places to visit in the day, like museums and galleries, places like that.
True, true. My own view is that some cities have an energy about them. They're exciting to be in.
And other cities are the opposite. Well, we've covered so much ground here. But I think there's one final aspect we should research.
What's that then?
The social aspect. Because, let's face it, cities are made up of people.
They are. And surely a successful city would be one where there is a sense of community, a place where people would feel safe and want to raise families in.
This topic is limitless.
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3.
Part 3.
You will hear part of a lecture about psychology.
First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 24.
In this lecture, I want to introduce you to the life and work of a famous psychologist, a psychologist who had a big influence on the field of social psychology. Social psychology deals with group behaviour and the individual as a member of a group, and Solomon Asch made a most important contribution. Solomon Asch worked mostly in the USA, but he was born in 1907 in Poland, and he came to the US when he was 13. He went to an ordinary high school, and as he had an interest in human behaviour, he decided to study psychology. He was quite disappointed with his first acquaintance with psychology. It seemed to be all about rats and mice, and that didn't interest him at all. However, he persevered and eventually became a professor of psychology. Now, the experiment which made his name is called the line judgment task. Participants were asked to compare some simple lines. More precisely, they were given a card with 3 lines, then were asked to compare another single line and say whether it was longer or shorter than the lines on the card. What a participant didn't know was that in reality all the other participants were effectively actors. That is, they were instructed to give a wrong judgment, and the purpose of the experiment was to see how the single subject would react.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 25 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 25 to 30.
Listen to the second part of the talk.
The subject would hear the others saying things about the length of the line which were clearly false. Most subjects answered correctly, in spite of the incorrect judgments of the others, but a proportion, 32%, conformed to the majority view, the incorrect view. This proportion was much, much higher than anticipated. Before the experiments, they'd thought 15% or lower might do this. To give you a bit more detail, I have an illustration up here on the board. A group of 6 or 7 people were given a card with 3 lines on it. There is a short vertical line, on the right of which is a longer line, and on the right of that there is another, still longer line. However, it's clear that the longest line is the right-hand one, the second longest, the middle one, and the shortest is the one on the left. The participants were given a second card with just 1 line on it. I should add that in these experiments people became very distressed. They found it very hard to deal with a situation where people were telling them things which were against the evidence of their own eyes. One woman became extremely agitated, running about measuring and looking and checking and shouting in a kind of massive anxiety. Now, what experiments which occurred sometime later found was that other factors can influence the result. For example, when there were more so-called participants, there was even more conformity. On the other hand, when people were able to respond in secrecy, by writing the result down, for instance, they made fewer incorrect judgments about the lines. Subjects gave various explanations for why they made the decisions they did. Although they weren't put under pressure by the experimenter, many felt that they would somehow spoil the experiment and upset the person running it if they didn't agree, no matter how stupid they felt. More simply, in other cases, they said they just wanted to not show themselves in a bad light. Whatever the reason, Ash's experiment has had a long history, and although incredibly...
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
Part 4.
This morning, I'd like to look at the whole issue of contemporary art. What it is, how do we interpret it, what are its uses, and does art, in effect, have any advantages or disadvantages for society?
First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Welcome to this series of lectures on interpreting contemporary art. This morning, I'd like to look at the whole issue of contemporary art. What it is, how do we interpret it, what are its uses, and does art, in effect, have any advantages or disadvantages for society? I think at this point it's important for me to clarify that I am looking at art from two main perspectives. Firstly, art as something made by and appreciated by individuals, and secondly, art's relationship with society, as it is society that supports, protects, and encourages art. And I'm hoping that this lecture will act as a springboard for you to revisit your own artistic experiences and question your own ideas of what contemporary art means. Throughout this series of lectures, I'll be looking at various examples of art to illustrate my points. However, if at any point I show you an example which is unfamiliar, then please tell me, as it is imperative that you be able to use your past experiences so that you can check to see if your ideas agree with mine. So if you have not seen a particular work of art before, then this will not work. And let me remind you now that at the end of these lectures, you will be given a written assignment which will consist of a 2,500-word critical essay. This is not an art review, but an analysis of what you think this kind of art means. Okay, so what is contemporary art? Well, my view is that contemporary art reflects a particular time in history. In terms of Western civilization, this is the period that became known as the Renaissance, which began roughly in 1450. But this becomes confusing as the modern era is also considered to be from 1789, from the time of the French Revolution. Added to this are modern ideas and modern art that developed from 1890. This period has also been called the turn of the century. To try and somehow bring all these periods together, I shall define contemporary art as any art created from 1920 up until the present day. Turning now to the question of whether or not art is useful for society. Well, when we look back at the history of the West, we can see that there has been a tradition, especially in Western Europe, of art that was official. This meant that the government sponsored or subsidized the art. It could be said, therefore, that art has a cultural use, in that it can represent both the culture and history of a country. And let's remember what I said earlier, that this is both the history and culture of a particular time. Now, the disadvantage of this kind of official art is that it tends to be academic. And by that, I mean it is art that requires the person looking at it to be educated in art, at least to some extent. So it seems to me that this restricts this type of art to a particular social group. And whether you agree with this concept or not will depend on if you believe that art should be accessible to everyone. Of course, with the rapid developments in technology and advertising, the television, computer, and various forms of digital media, art has changed. And although there will always be a need for art to be subsidized by governments, we see today art forms that are surviving on individual subsidy. Sometimes this is through the support of wealthy patrons, such as businessmen or famous people. But it also operates on a more simple level. I refer here to the art that is done on walls and in streets, sometimes called amateur art. But it is the art of graffiti, and it is now accepted as an art form in itself. So here we come to what I see as another advantage for society, in that art is a means by which people can express their ideas, their feelings. Of course, in the case of graffiti, there is much debate as to whether the advantages outweigh the more negative side, which is when graffiti artists paint on public buildings. This creates unnecessary expense and also damages these buildings, which are meant for public use. We will be looking at some examples of this later on. Now, many critics of contemporary art have pointed to art that is often violent and even obscene. But I would like to suggest that such art is not meant to only shock us. It also has the element of exposure, so it can teach us about the violence in society. This then brings us to another advantage of art. It can raise awareness, help us see things in a different light. The disadvantage of this is that art can be dangerous. What I'm saying here is that if we accept that contemporary art has the power to influence our feelings and attitudes, then we have to accept that art can evoke negative feelings like anger as much as it can give us feelings of hope and peace. But art is, after all, about us, so it can be about our beliefs and our behavior. And as human beings, we possess both positive and negative traits. I'd like to show you some slides now to illustrate what I've been talking about.
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.